The Japanese soldier couldn't believe what he was seeing. Blood poured from his leg, shrapnel embedded deep in muscle and bone. 3 feet away, an American Marine sat with his own stomach wound, crimson spreading across torn fabric. And the American medic knelt beside the enemy, working on him first, ignoring his own wounded brother. The Japanese soldier had been told Americans were monsters, told they'd execute prisoners, torture them, leave them to die. But this medic was cleaning his wound, stopping his bleeding, saving his life while an American bled out waiting. What they never taught in propaganda, what no one warned him about. The enemy was supposed to be cruel, supposed to be heartless. That's what made dying for the emperor easier. That's what made suicide charges make sense. But this medic's hands were gentle, his face focused, professional, like the soldier's nationality didn't matter, like being human was enough. 12 hours earlier, the battle for Okinawa had been raging for 6 weeks. Private Hiroshi Yamamoto crouched in a collapsed bunker, hands shaking, rifle clutched against his chest. He was 19 years old, had been in the Imperial Army for 8 months, had never fired his weapon at a living person until 3 days ago. Now he'd lost count. Americans kept coming, wave after wave, like they had infinite soldiers, infinite ammunition, infinite everything. His commanding officer, Lieutenant Saito, was dead, killed by machine gun fire that morning. Half their unit was gone. The other half scattered across the island, hiding in caves, in ruins, in whatever holes they could find. Orders were simple. Fight to the death. Never surrender. Death before dishonor. The emperor demanded it. Japan demanded it. Surrender meant shame worse than death. Meant family dishonor. Meant being erased from history like he never existed. But Hiroshi was tired. So tired. Hadn't slept more than an hour at a time in days. Hadn't eaten a full meal in 2 weeks. The supply lines were cut. No food coming. No ammunition. No reinforcements. Just orders to fight. To die. To take as many Americans with them as possible. He heard movement outside the bunker. American voices, loud, confident, speaking that harsh foreign language he couldn't understand. He pressed himself against the wall, trying to be invisible, trying to decide if this was the moment, if this was when he'd die. The explosion came without warning. Grenade through the bunker entrance. Hiroshi dove, but not fast enough. Shrapnel tore through his left leg. Pain white-hot and immediate. He screamed. Couldn't help it. Then Americans were inside. 3 of them. Rifles pointed. Shouting. He couldn't understand the words, but understood the meaning. Surrender or die. His rifle was 5 feet away. Might as well be 5 miles. His leg wouldn't move. Blood everywhere. He raised his hands. Thought about the grenade in his pocket. The one he was supposed to use on himself if capture seemed certain. Reached for it. Don't. One of the Americans shouted. Must have seen the movement. Rifle barrel inches from Hiroshi's face. Hiroshi froze. This was it. Execution. The propaganda had been right. But the American didn't fire. Lowered his rifle slightly. Said something to his companions. One of them left running. The other 2 stayed, weapons ready, but not shooting. Why weren't they shooting? Hiroshi waited for death that didn't come. Minutes passed like hours. Then more Americans arrived. One wearing different gear. Red cross on his helmet. On his arm, medic. The medic pushed past the soldiers. Knelt beside Hiroshi. Started examining the leg wound. Hands moving fast. Professional. Hiroshi tried to pull away. This was trick. Had to be. The medic said something. Tone calm, reassuring, like talking to scared animal. Pulled out medical supplies. Started working. That's when Hiroshi noticed the other American. The Marine sitting against the wall, hand pressed to his stomach. Blood between his fingers. Face pale. Breathing shallow. Wounded. Needing help. And the medic was helping Hiroshi instead. It made no sense. Why save the enemy when your own man was dying? The medic worked fast. Cut away Hiroshi's torn uniform. Cleaned the wound. The pain was incredible, but the medic's hands were efficient. Knew what they were doing. Applied something that burned, then numbed. Wrapped bandages tight. Stopped the bleeding. All while the wounded Marine watched. All while Hiroshi's mind struggled to understand what was happening. When the medic finished with Hiroshi, he moved to the Marine. Started treating that stomach wound. The Marine said something. Sounded like complaint. Like, why'd you help him first? The medic's response was short, firm. The Marine went quiet. Let himself be treated. Hiroshi lay there, leg throbbing but bandaged. Alive. Saved by the people he'd been trying to kill hours before. They carried him out on a stretcher. Through the ruins of what used to be a village. Past bodies. Japanese and American mixed together in death. Past destroyed tanks. Shattered buildings. The smell of smoke and blood and death everywhere. Other prisoners were being gathered. Maybe 20 Japanese soldiers. Some wounded. Some not. All looking terrified. All expecting execution. It's what they'd been taught. What propaganda promised. Americans didn't take prisoners. Americans tortured. Americans were monsters. But there was no execution. Instead, there was a processing area. More medics. Treating wounds. American soldiers standing guard, but not being brutal. Not beating prisoners. Not torturing. Just watching. Making sure no one tried anything. Hiroshi was placed on the ground with other wounded. An American doctor came by. Examined his leg. Said something to a medic. The medic brought water. Actual clean water. Offered it to Hiroshi. He stared at it. Suspicious. Was it poisoned? The medic took a drink first. Then offered again. Hiroshi drank. It was the best water he'd ever tasted. Over the next hours, Hiroshi watched. Watched Americans treat Japanese wounded with the same care as their own. Watched them share rations with prisoners who hadn't eaten in days. Watched them be professional, efficient, not cruel. Not the monsters from propaganda. Just soldiers doing a job. And part of that job, apparently, was keeping prisoners alive. The Japanese soldier in the cot next to Hiroshi had been shot through the shoulder. Was delirious with fever. An American medic sat with him through the night. Changing bandages. Giving medicine. Talking in English, the soldier couldn't understand, but the tone was kind. When the fever broke at dawn, the medic smiled. Actually smiled. Like he was genuinely happy a Japanese soldier lived. Hiroshi's worldview was shattering. Everything he'd been taught. Everything he'd believed. The Emperor had said Americans were subhuman. Evil. That dying was better than capture, because capture meant torture and death anyway. But Hiroshi was captured. And he was being fed. Given medical care. Treated like a human being. How was this possible? How did propaganda get it so wrong? Across the ocean, a different story was unfolding, but with the same themes, same questions, same shattering of propaganda. Obergefreiter Klaus Weber huddled in a foxhole in the Ardennes forest, December 1944. The Battle of the Bulge was Germany's last desperate push, Hitler's final gamble to turn the tide. And it was failing. Klaus had known it would fail from the start, had known since Stalingrad, since North Africa, since the Allies landed in Normandy. Germany was losing, had been losing for 2 years. But saying that out loud meant execution. So Klaus kept quiet and followed orders and watched friends die for a cause already lost. He was 23 years old, had been in the Wehrmacht since he was 17, had fought in Poland, in France, in Russia, had seen things he'd never be able to forget, things that woke him screaming when he managed to sleep. He wasn't a Nazi, wasn't a true believer, just a German who'd been conscripted, who did what he was told because refusing meant death, who survived by keeping his head down and his mouth shut. Now he was in Belgium, surrounded by American forces. His unit had been cut off during a failed advance. Most were dead, the survivors scattered. Klaus had been in this foxhole for 2 days. No food, little water, ammunition almost gone, waiting for either rescue that wouldn't come or death that seemed certain. He could hear American voices, tanks, artillery. They were everywhere. It was over. The Americans found him at dawn. 3 soldiers. Rifles pointed, shouting. Klaus raised his hands immediately. No fight left in him. No desire to die for a war already lost. They pulled him from the foxhole, searched him, took his weapon, his gear, tied his hands. Klaus waited for the bullet. That's what happened to prisoners, right? That's what the SS told them. Americans executed prisoners. It's why surrendering was weakness, why dying in battle was better. But there was no bullet. Instead, they marched him through the forest, to a collection point where other German prisoners sat under guard. Maybe 50 men, all looking defeated, exhausted, relieved to be alive. An American officer was questioning prisoners, speaking German, asking about unit positions, strength. Klaus answered honestly. What did it matter now? The officer wrote notes, moved to the next prisoner, professional, not cruel. Then something strange happened. An American soldier appeared with a tray, coffee and donuts, actual coffee. Klaus could smell it from 10 feet away. Real coffee, not the terrible substitute Germany had been using for years. The soldier moved through the prisoners, offering coffee, offering donuts, like he was a waiter at a restaurant. Klaus stared when the cup was offered to him. This had to be a trick, some kind of test. But the American just stood there, waiting. Klaus took the cup with bound hands, took a sip. It was hot, strong, delicious. He hadn't tasted real coffee in 3 years. The donut was even better, sweet, soft. Klaus ate it slowly, making it last. Around him, other German prisoners were doing the same, drinking coffee, eating donuts, looking confused. One older soldier, a Feldwebel with Iron Cross on his chest, said what they were all thinking. This doesn't make sense. They're supposed to be evil. We were told they'd torture us, kill us. Why are they giving us coffee? Klaus had no answer. Just like Hiroshi in the Pacific, Klaus's propaganda-built worldview was crumbling. Everything he'd been told about Americans being cruel, being inhuman, being the enemy of civilization, all of it contradicted by a cup of coffee and a donut. It was such a small thing, but it meant everything. It meant seeing the enemy as human, as people who had food and chose to share it, who had prisoners and chose to treat them decently. The American soldier who'd brought the coffee came by again, offering refills, actually offering seconds. Klaus held out his cup. The soldier filled it, smiled, said something in English. Klaus didn't understand, but the tone was friendly. Not the tone of a guard to a prisoner. Just one person to another. Klaus felt something he hadn't felt in years. Hope. That maybe surviving this war was possible. That maybe going home to Germany was something he could actually do. They were loaded onto trucks, driven to a POW processing center. More Americans. More efficiency. They were registered, given numbers, had their wounds treated. Klaus had frostbite on his toes. An American medic spent 20 minutes treating it, carefully, thoroughly, explaining in broken German what he was doing. Gave Klaus clean socks. Actual clean socks. It was the kind of care Klaus hadn't received from his own army in months. The POW camp was nothing like propaganda described. Yes, there were fences, guards, rules, but there was also food. 3 meals a day. Not great food, but edible. More than German soldiers were getting at the front. There were barracks with roofs, bunks with blankets, heat. Klaus hadn't been warm in weeks. That first night, sleeping in an actual bed, with a full stomach, in a heated building, Klaus cried. Not from sadness. From relief. He'd survived. Against all odds, he'd survived. Over the following days, Klaus learned the routine. Morning roll call. Work details. Meals, recreation time. The Americans ran the camp professionally. Strictly, but not cruelly. There were rules, and breaking them had consequences. But following them meant being treated reasonably. It was so different from what Klaus had expected, from what he'd been told. And every morning there was coffee. Not great coffee, but coffee. And often doughnuts. Or bread, or something sweet. The Americans seemed to have unlimited supplies. Unlimited everything. Klaus watched trucks arrive daily. Food, medicine, supplies, so much that some was given to prisoners. It made Klaus realize something. Germany had already lost. Had lost the moment America entered the war. You can't fight a country that has so much it gives doughnuts to prisoners. Back in the Pacific, Hiroshi was having similar thoughts. The POW camp on Okinawa was temporary. Tents and wire fences. But there was food. Medical care. Americans walking around with so much stuff. One Marine had given Hiroshi a chocolate bar. Just handed it over like it was nothing. Chocolate. Real chocolate. Hiroshi hadn't seen chocolate since before the war. The Marine smiled and walked away. Didn't want anything in return. Just sharing because he could. Hiroshi started talking to other prisoners. Sharing stories. Every one of them told the same tale. Expected brutality. Got humanity instead. Expected torture. Got medical care. Expected death. Got life. An older soldier, a corporal named Takeshi, put it into words. We've been lied to. About everything? The emperor lied. The generals lied. They told us death was better than capture. But capture means living. Means going home someday. They sent us to die for lies. It was dangerous talk. Even among prisoners, even defeated, some still believed. Still held on to the propaganda. Would report anyone speaking against the emperor. But most were like Hiroshi, tired, disillusioned, grateful to be alive. The propaganda couldn't survive contact with reality. Couldn't survive American medics treating Japanese wounds. American soldiers sharing rations. American humanity showing through. An American officer came through the camp one day. Spoke Japanese. Explained what would happen next. They'd be transferred to camps in Hawaii. Eventually to camps in the continental United States. The war would end. When it did, they'd go home. Back to Japan. Back to families. The officer was clear, honest, direct. treated them like people who deserved to know their fate. It was more respect than Japanese officers had ever shown, more honesty than the emperor had ever given. The transfer to Hawaii took 2 weeks. Ship journey across the Pacific. Hiroshi stood on deck, watching the ocean, thinking about his family, his mother, his sister. Were they alive? Had the bombings reached their village? Would there be a home to return to? He didn't know. Might never know. But at least he was alive to wonder. Alive because an American medic had chosen to save him before saving his own man. In Germany, Klaus was also being transferred, from Belgium to France, then to a ship bound for America, the continental United States. Klaus had heard of it, the land of cowboys and gangsters, of Hollywood and skyscrapers. He'd never imagined he'd see it, never imagined he'd survive the war at all. Yet here he was, on a ship, headed to the enemy's homeland, expecting ... what? He didn't know anymore. Expectations kept being wrong. The ship arrived in New York. Klaus stood with hundreds of other German POWs, staring at the Statue of Liberty. The symbolism wasn't lost on him. Liberty, freedom, concepts Germany had abandoned years ago. Concepts he'd fought to destroy. And now here he was, being taken into the heart of it. The irony was almost funny. They were transported to a POW camp in Texas. The train ride took days. Klaus watched America pass by the window. Farms, towns, cities, everything intact, undamaged, no bomb craters, no destroyed buildings. The war hadn't touched this place. Klaus saw children playing, people shopping, normal life continuing like there wasn't a war at all. It hit him then. Really hit him. America was fighting a war on 2 fronts, sending millions of soldiers overseas, and life here just continued. They had that much capacity, that much strength. Germany could never compete. The Texas camp was huge. Thousands of POWs, German, Italian, some Japanese, all separated but all treated similarly. There were work details. German prisoners worked on farms, in factories, helping with the American war effort. Klaus was assigned to a farm, picking cotton. Hard work, but not terrible. The American farmer who owned the land would bring lunch, sandwiches, lemonade, would sit and eat with the prisoners, talk despite the language barrier, show pictures of his son serving in Europe. The farmer's son was fighting Klaus's countrymen. Yet here the farmer was, treating Klaus like a person, feeding him, being kind. It messed with Klaus's head. Everything did. The coffee every morning, the doughnuts, the kindness from people whose country Germany had declared war on, whose friends and family German soldiers were killing. Yet they shared food, gave medical care, treated prisoners like humans. It made Klaus ashamed of what Germany had become, what Germany had done. He learned things in that camp, things about Germany that propaganda never mentioned, things about concentration camps, about mass murder, about the Holocaust. At first, Klaus didn't believe it, couldn't believe it. That was Allied propaganda. Had to be. But then there were photos, testimonies, evidence, and Klaus remembered things. Remembered trains he'd seen. Remembered camps he'd marched past. Remembered things he'd heard, but ignored because acknowledging them was too terrible. The shame grew, deepened. Klaus started understanding why the Americans treated them well. Not because Germans deserved it, but because Americans believed in something. Something about human dignity, about rules even in war, about being better than the enemy. That's what separated civilization from barbarity. Not strength, not victory, but how you treated those weaker than you. There was a library in the camp, books in German. Klaus started reading philosophy, history, things banned in Germany, things that showed different perspectives. He read about democracy, about freedom, about why America fought, not for conquest, not for empire, but for principles, for ideas. It all seemed so strange to Klaus, so foreign. Germany fought for blood and soil, for racial purity, for domination. America fought for freedom, for people they'd never meet in countries they'd never visit. It seemed too noble to be real, but the evidence was everywhere. The coffee, the doughnuts, the medical care, the basic human decency. Back in Hawaii, Hiroshi was having similar realizations. The POW camp was on a hillside overlooking the ocean. Paradise, except for the fences. But even the fences weren't terrible. There was food, shelter. Americans taught them English. Let them play baseball. Treated them like humans temporarily separated from freedom, not like enemies to be destroyed. Hiroshi learned about Japanese-American soldiers, men of Japanese descent who chose to fight for America, who fought harder than anyone to prove their loyalty. It confused Hiroshi. How could Japanese people choose America over Japan? How could they fight their own blood? But talking to the guards, some of whom were Japanese-American, Hiroshi started understanding. America wasn't about blood, wasn't about race, was about ideas, about choosing to be part of something, about freedom to become who you wanted to be. It was so different from Japan, so different from the emperor system, from the rigid hierarchy, from being told your worth was determined by birth. One guard, a Japanese-American sergeant from California, sat with Hiroshi one day, explained what democracy was, what freedom meant. In Japan, you're told who you are, the sergeant said in Japanese. In America, you choose. That's the difference. That's why we fight. Not for land, for the right to choose. Hiroshi thought about that, about choice. He'd never had a choice. Born in Japan, conscripted into the army, told to fight, told to die, never asked what he wanted, never given options, just orders. And he'd followed them because that's what you did in Japan. Obedience was everything. But what if there was another way? What if you could choose your path? Choose your life. The idea was revolutionary, dangerous, intoxicating. When the war ended in August 1945, Hiroshi was still in Hawaii. He heard about the atomic bombs, about Japan's surrender, about the emperor's radio address admitting defeat. Hiroshi cried, not from sadness about defeat, but relief. Relief it was over. Relief he'd lived through it. Relief he could go home. Except there might not be a home. Japan was destroyed. Cities in ruins. Millions dead. What would he return to? The Americans organized the repatriation. Ships to take Japanese POWs home. Hiroshi boarded one in November 1945, 6 months after the war ended. The journey took weeks. When he finally saw Japan, saw the coast, saw the devastation, he wept. His country was broken, ruined. How would it rebuild? How would they survive? But there was hope too, because the Americans weren't being cruel, weren't executing, weren't enslaving. Instead, they were helping, sending food, medicine, supplies, helping Japan rebuild. General MacArthur was in charge, running Japan like a benevolent dictator. And while Hiroshi wasn't sure about Americans running his country, he knew it could be worse. Much worse. Japan had done terrible things in Asia, in China, in Korea, in the Philippines. The conquered people could have demanded revenge, could have destroyed Japan completely. But America said no, sighed rebuild instead, said democracy instead of revenge. Hiroshi returned to his village, found his mother and sister alive. His father had died in the bombing, but his family survived. They had nothing, no food, no money, no prospects, but they were alive. And slowly, with American help, Japan started rebuilding. Hiroshi got a job working for the occupation forces, translating, helping with reconstruction. He worked alongside American soldiers, men who could have hated him for being the enemy, but who treated him as a colleague, as a person. Years later, Hiroshi would tell his children about the war, about being a soldier, about being captured, about expecting death and receiving kindness, about the medic who saved his life while his own man bled, about learning that enemies can be human, that propaganda lies, that sometimes the people you're taught to hate are the ones who save you. In Germany, Klaus's story followed a similar path. He stayed in the Texas camp until 1946. The war in Europe had ended, May 1945, but repatriation took time. There were millions of German POWs. Logistics were complicated. Klaus didn't mind waiting. America was nice. Food was plentiful. Work was available. Some German prisoners didn't want to go home, wanted to stay, become Americans. Klaus understood. Germany was destroyed, divided between Soviets and Western allies. Future uncertain. America was prosperous, intact, free. Klaus chose to return. But he returned changed. The propaganda was gone, burned away by the reality of American kindness. He'd learned English, learned about democracy, learned that enemies don't have to be monsters, that soldiers on different sides are still humans, that war is choice made by leaders, not by people. Klaus went home to a Germany divided. He ended up in the Western Zone, under American, British, and French occupation. Better than the Soviet zone. Much better. He helped rebuild, worked construction, helped make Germany whole again. The Americans helped too. Marshall Plan money, food, supplies, helping former enemies rebuild. Klaus remembered the coffee and donuts, remembered the small kindnesses, and he understood. This was America's power, not just military strength, but the power of ideals, the power of believing in something bigger than yourself. Decades later, Klaus would visit America. Tourist trip in the 1970s. He'd walk around New York, Texas, see the places he'd been as a prisoner, see them as a free man. He'd drink coffee in a diner, eat a donut. Remember being 19, being defeated, being scared, and being treated with dignity by people who didn't have to be kind, who could have been cruel, who chose humanity instead. Both stories, Hiroshi's and Klaus's, teach the same lesson, that propaganda dies when it meets reality, that enemies are still human, that the strongest power isn't weapons, but principles, that choosing to treat prisoners well, to share coffee and donuts, to save enemy wounded before your own, those choices matter. They echo through generations. They change people. They prove that civilization isn't about who's strongest, but about who maintains humanity, even in war's worst moments. The medic who saved Hiroshi didn't know he was teaching a Japanese soldier about American values. He was just doing his job, following the rules, treating humans like humans. But that simple act, repeated millions of times by millions of Americans throughout the war, changed how enemies saw them, changed how the world saw them, proved that America's real strength wasn't just industrial capacity or military might, but the belief that some things matter more than victory. Things like human dignity, like compassion, like remembering that soldiers on both sides are people who want to go home. The coffee and donuts Klaus received weren't strategic, weren't propaganda, were just Americans sharing what they had with people who had nothing. Because that's what you do. Because kindness costs little and means everything. Because treating prisoners well isn't weakness but strength. Shows you're not fighting to become like your enemy, but to remain better than them. Both Hiroshi and Klaus became ambassadors for reconciliation, for understanding, for remembering that wars end, but how you treat people during war determines what comes after. Germany and Japan became American allies, became democracies, became prosperous nations, not because America forced them, but because America showed them there was a better way, showed them through small acts, through medical care, through coffee and donuts, through choosing humanity. The Japanese soldier who expected torture and got bandages. The German soldier who expected execution and got breakfast. Both learned the same lesson, that propaganda can't survive truth, that enemies can choose to be human to each other, that the hardest thing in war is maintaining civilization's values when everything screams for revenge. But America tried, didn't always succeed, made mistakes, did terrible things too, but overall tried to be better. Tried to remember that soldiers are people, that prisoners deserve dignity. That war doesn't excuse abandoning humanity. This matters because war hasn't ended, won't end. Humans fight, always have, always will. But how we fight matters. The rules matter. The choices matter. Saving enemy wounded, feeding enemy prisoners, treating defeated enemies with respect. These aren't weaknesses, are strengths, are what separates civilization from barbarity, are what make victory meaningful. Hiroshi died in 1998. An old man, father, grandfather, lived to see Japan become one of the world's richest nations, lived to see Japanese-American friendship, lived to see his grandchildren study in America. Never forgot the medic. Never forgot that moment when everything he believed was proven wrong. Would tell anyone who'd listen. The enemy saved his life. The enemy he'd been taught to hate showed him kindness. Changed everything. Klaus died in 2003. Also old. Also father and grandfather. Lived to see Germany reunified. Lived to see the Berlin Wall fall. Lived to see Germany and America as close allies. Never forgot the coffee. Never forgot the donuts. Never forgot being treated like a human when he expected to be treated like an animal. Would tell his grandchildren. Share the story. Make sure they understood that even in war's darkest moments, people can choose kindness, can choose humanity. And those choices matter more than any battle won or lost. If you found this story powerful, drop a comment below telling us what you think about how enemies treated each other in World War II and how different it could have been. Their stories aren't unique. Thousands of Japanese soldiers, thousands of German soldiers, captured by Americans, expecting the worst based on propaganda, receiving basic human decency instead. Not luxury, not comfort, but food, water, medical care, the basics of humanity. And for men starving and wounded and defeated, those basics were miracles, were proof that enemies don't have to be evil, that soldiers on opposite sides are still humans who bleed and hurt and want to survive. The American medics who treated Japanese wounded weren't heroes. Not really. Were just doing their jobs, following training, following values. American values that said all lives matter. All wounded deserve care, not because they're friends, but because they're human. The American soldiers who shared coffee weren't being soft, were being strategic, were showing defeated enemies that America wasn't the monster propaganda painted, was showing that surrender didn't mean death, meant survival, meant eventual freedom. This psychological warfare was more effective than any bomb, more powerful than any weapon, because it broke the enemy's will, not through fear, but through kindness, through showing that propaganda lied, through proving that surrender was a viable option, better than dying for lost causes. Japanese soldiers in the Pacific started surrendering in larger numbers as word spread. German soldiers in Europe actively sought American lines, avoided Soviet forces, because everyone knew surrender to Americans meant coffee and donuts. Surrender to Soviets meant death marches and labor camps. The different treatment wasn't accident, was policy. Geneva Conventions required it. International law demanded it. But more than law, it was American identity. America saw itself as civilized, as better than enemies, had to prove it through actions, had to show that fighting monsters didn't require becoming monsters, that maintaining humanity, even in war's chaos, was possible, was necessary. Not every American lived up to this standard. There were massacres. There were war crimes. There were moments when rage and revenge overwhelmed principles. The Pacific War was particularly brutal. Japanese soldiers committed atrocities. American soldiers sometimes responded in kind. War brings out worst in people: fear, hatred, desire for revenge. But overall, systematic policy was different. Was about maintaining civilization standards even when fighting total war. This policy had roots in American history, American identity, the idea that America was exceptional, was different, was better, not because of race or blood, but because of values, because of believing in something bigger than nationalism, bigger than tribal loyalty, believing in universal human rights, in dignity, in worth of every individual regardless of nationality. These weren't just words, were principles tested in war's crucible. When medics treated Japanese wounded, they tested principles. When soldiers shared rations with German prisoners, they tested identity. And mostly, America passed. Not perfectly, not always, but enough. Enough that former enemies became friends. Enough that defeated nations rebuilt as democracies. Enough that the world saw America differently, not as conqueror, but as liberator, not as enemy, but as hope. This reputation mattered, still matters, shaped the post-war world, made American leadership acceptable to former enemies, made American values attractive to defeated populations, made rebuilding possible. Germany could have become vengeful like after World War I, could have festered with resentment, could have spawned another Hitler. But American treatment of German cause, American help rebuilding Germany, American commitment to European recovery changed trajectory, showed there was different way. Japan could have remained militaristic, could have nursed grievances, could have seen defeat as temporary setback. But American occupation, American reforms, American respect for Japanese culture while insisting on democratic change created different outcome, created partnership instead of enmity, created ally instead of future enemy. Both transformations started with small things: coffee and donuts, medical care for wounded prisoners, basic human decency when cruelty would have been easier. These small acts accumulated, built trust, built relationships, built foundation for peace. Because soldiers who received coffee remembered kindness from enemies, told families, told friends, told children, and gradually hatred faded, replaced by respect, by understanding, by recognition that former enemies were humans who'd been caught in terrible circumstances. The medic who saved Hiroshi probably never knew what happened to that Japanese soldier. Probably saved dozens, hundreds, too many to remember individual faces. But Hiroshi remembered every detail, remembered being convinced he'd die, remembered the shock of being saved, remembered the American Marine bleeding while the medic worked on enemy, remembered thinking his worldview was completely wrong, that everything he'd been taught was lies. That memory shaped Hiroshi's post-war life, shaped how he raised his children, taught them to question propaganda, to recognize humanity in others, to understand nationality doesn't determine worth, that enemies today can be friends tomorrow, that wars are temporary, but how you treat people during war determines the future. Klaus had similar memories. The coffee was decent. The donuts were good. But what mattered was the gesture, was Americans who could have let prisoners starve, instead choosing to share, was guards who could have been cruel choosing to be professional, was a system that treated prisoners like humans temporarily detained, not like animals to be destroyed. Klaus told his grandchildren about the camp, about work details on farms, about learning English, about making friends with American guards, about being allowed to play soccer, about receiving letters from home, about being treated like a person with rights, even as prisoner of war. His grandchildren couldn't believe it, couldn't imagine enemies being kind. But Klaus insisted, made them understand that Americans chose to be better, chose to maintain civilization, chose to remember that war ends, but how you act during war determines what comes next. Both men, Hiroshi and Klaus, lived long enough to see the results. Saw Germany and Japan become democracies, become economic powerhouses, become American allies. Saw former enemies become friends. Saw their grandchildren study in America, work with Americans, marry Americans. The war that had defined their youth became history. Painful history, but history nonetheless. And the bridge from enemy to friend was built on small acts, on coffee and donuts, on medical care, on choosing humanity. There's a lesson here that transcends World War II, transcends any specific war. The lesson that how you treat defeated enemies determines the future. That cruelty breeds resentment. That kindness, even to enemies, builds foundations for peace. That the strongest nations aren't those who can destroy enemies, but those who can transform enemies into allies. That revenge feels good in the moment, but reconciliation builds lasting peace. America wasn't perfect. Made mistakes, committed atrocities, dropped atomic bombs on Japan, firebombed German cities, did terrible things in pursuit of victory. But in treatment of prisoners, in daily interactions between captors and captives, mostly tried to maintain standards, tried to be civilized, and that effort mattered. Changed outcomes, changed the world. Hiroshi's children became engineers, doctors, business people, successful and rebuilt Japan. Some worked for American companies. Some married Americans. Some emigrated to America. The enemy nation became land of opportunity, became friend. All because in 1945, a medic chose to save enemy wounded, chose humanity over tribalism, chose to remember that beneath uniforms, soldiers are just humans. Klaus's children also prospered, grew up in democratic West Germany, benefited from Marshall Plan, benefited from American commitment to European recovery. Some joined NATO forces, served alongside Americans, protected Europe together. The enemy became ally. The defeated nation became partner. All because in 1944, an American soldier chose to share coffee and donuts with prisoners who'd been trying to kill him hours before. These stories matter because war hasn't ended, because humans still fight, still have enemies, still face choices about how to treat those enemies. The easy choice is cruelty, is revenge, is treating enemies as less than human. History shows where that leads, to endless cycles of violence, to permanent enmity, to futures poisoned by past grievances. The hard choice is maintaining civilization, is treating enemies with dignity even when they don't deserve it, is remembering that wars end, but how you conduct yourself during war determines what comes after, is choosing long-term peace over short-term revenge, is being strategic enough to see that making friends of defeated enemies is smarter than making permanent enemies. America understood this after World War II, not from altruism, but from cold calculation. If Germany and Japan remained enemies, if they became Soviet allies, if they harbored resentments and sought revenge, the future would be dangerous. But if they became democracies, if they became allies, if they integrated into American-led world order, everyone prospered. So America chose reconstruction over punishment, chose partnership over domination, chose making friends of former enemies. And it started with small acts. Medics treating wounds, soldiers sharing rations, guards being professional rather than cruel, camp administrators following Geneva Conventions. These individual choices, made by millions of Americans, created conditions for peace, created possibility of transformation, created the world we live in today, where Germany and Japan are democracies and allies and friends. Hiroshi and Klaus are gone now. Their generation is dying. Soon no one will be left who remembers World War II firsthand. But their stories survive. Their lessons endure. That enemies are humans. That propaganda lies. That kindness isn't weakness, but strategy. That how you treat defeated enemies determines whether they become friends or remain forever hostile. When that medic treated Hiroshi's wounds, he wasn't thinking about grand strategy, wasn't thinking about transforming enemies into allies, was just following training, following values, treating all wounded equally because that's what civilized people do. But that individual act, multiplied millions of times, changed the world, proved that maintaining humanity even in war's darkest moments is possible, is necessary, is what separates civilization from savagery. When that soldier offered close coffee, he wasn't thinking about rebuilding Europe, wasn't thinking about creating lasting peace, was just sharing what he had, because prisoners were hungry and he had extra. But that small kindness, replicated across thousands of camps, showed defeated Germans that Americans weren't monsters. Were just people. People who could be reasoned with, worked with, eventually befriended. The coffee and donuts weren't policy. The medical care was. But both mattered. Both showed that America, for all its flaws, tried to maintain standards. Tried to remember that even in total war, some things matter more than victory. Things like humanity, like civilization, like remembering that beneath flags and uniforms, we're all just humans trying to survive. This is why these stories matter, why they need to be remembered, why they need to be told to new generations who haven't experienced war, who don't understand how easy it is to dehumanize enemies, how easy it is to justify cruelty, how easy it is to abandon civilization standards when you're scared and angry and convinced the other side is evil. These stories are reminders that maintaining humanity is possible, that enemies can become friends, that small acts of kindness have enormous consequences, that how you treat people when you have power over them reveals who you really are. That true strength isn't cruelty, but the ability to remain civilized, even when being savage would be easier. Subscribe if you want to hear more stories like this about moments in history when humanity triumphed over hatred. The medic who saved Hiroshi. The soldier who shared coffee with Klaus. They weren't heroes. Were just Americans doing their jobs, following their values, being who they were raised to be. But their actions, their choices, their basic human decency and circumstances that excused cruelty, those choices changed the world, built bridges from enemy to friend, created conditions for lasting peace, proved that even in war, maintaining civilization matters, always matters, will always matter.